Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to start off by acknowledging the horrific destruction that we witnessed over the weekend in Kentucky. I saw a headline this morning that 12 children were among the 74 killed by that storm. Of course, the death toll is expected to only rise in the coming days. It's just unbelievably tragic news. My heart goes out to the families who are experiencing this devastating loss of their lives, their families. All of our thoughts are with them. I would suggest that today's hearing is about HUD's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, or the CDBGDR. This is about something different. Since 1993, Congress has spent nearly $90 billion through CDBGDR to support disaster recovery efforts. Initially, CDBGDR was used in rare cases when the billions of dollars that Congress spent annually on disaster recovery through other programs was considered insufficient to meet the needs of serious disasters. Unfortunately, since Superstorm Sandy in 2012, CDBGDR spending has become routine. In the past 4 years alone, we've appropriated almost $40 billion for CDBGDR. And we've done this through, though billions of dollars of CDBGDR funds appropriated for prior disasters, including the 9/11 attacks and disasters that occurred more than a decade ago, remain with grantees and remain unspent. So I worry that making CDBGDR a permanent program without a more comprehensive review of disaster assistance will only ensure that this wasteful trend continues. In my view, we ought to be discussing whether such spending through HUD is appropriate in the first place, not making it permanent, because we already have an agency whose sole mission is, and I quote, to help people before, during, and after disasters, end quote. That agency is called FEMA. Through the normal appropriations process, Congress provides billions every year to FEMA and other agencies so that the federal government can provide assistance to support communities struck by disasters. In addition to those regular channels, Congress makes emergency supplemental disaster appropriations almost every single year. Let's consider some key examples of existing programs. The Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA deploy boots on the ground to help survivors and repair damage to communities. FEMA funds repairs and replacement of homes for displaced families. Small Business Administration does as well, including replacement of personal property. Given all of this support, why do we also need CDBGDR? Now, theoretically, CDBGDR is supposed to support longer-term recovery needs that aren't met by other sources. And I acknowledge there may be some circumstances where it's useful for the federal government to help meet those needs. But we need to remember that states and local governments are primarily responsible for addressing these needs. Currently, states and local governments are not lacking for financial resources at all. In 2020, state and local tax collections set an all-time record. On top of their record tax collections, Congress sent another $900 billion to state and local governments for COVID relief over the course of the year. This included $5 billion specifically for CDBG, a significant portion of which remains unspent and is available for purposes such as disaster relief. And then in November, Congress just passed a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that will send billions more dollars to state and local governments, while states are sitting on record budget surpluses and have more money on the way now, thanks to this recently passed bill. Why shouldn't they plan and save some of that money for long-term disaster recovery and mitigation? We also shouldn't ignore the fact that CDBGDR has long been plagued by waste, fraud, and abuse through the years. Let's consider some examples of that waste. 2 years after Hurricane Katrina hit, HUD allowed Louisiana to use CDBGDR funds to pay college professors stipends to stay in the state post-Katrina because that was an urgent need activity. In Mississippi, HUD allowed a county to use $9.6 million CDBGDR funds to build a wastewater treatment facility for an undeveloped plot of land where nobody lived. As bad as these cases of waste are, the examples of fraud in the CDBGDR may be even worse. HUD's Inspector General has repeatedly identified and referred for prosecution cases of fraud and abuse in CDBGDR, including public corruption, embezzlement, bid rigging, bribery, and kickback schemes. So given this track record, it makes one wonder, how well does HUD respond to fraud risks in the CDBGDR program? Well, we know the answer to that. This year, HUD officials admitted to GAO that HUD, and I quote, does not consider fraud risks in programs managed by grantees to be direct risks to HUD itself, end quote. In other words, HUD's responsibility to root out fraud ends when it sends CDBG-DR money to states. Well, that's concerning since Congress recently appropriated nearly $20 billion through CDBG-DR to Puerto Rico that the Biden administration has been eager to quickly distribute to a government with rampant fiscal mismanagement, to say the least. Today we'll hear from Matt Mayer, a former DHS official and an expert on disaster recovery who has concerns with proposals to permanently authorize the CDBG-DR program. As Mr. Mayer notes, the over-federalization of disaster assistance for virtually every disaster has allowed states to just reduce their own emergency management programs, knowing that federal taxpayers will be forced to bail them out. He also sensibly notes that Congress should step back and consider whether it should continue to federalize virtually all long-term disaster recovery well after the crisis has passed, since that has traditionally been a state and local function. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses about the CDBG-DR program. I recognize that improvements are needed in how the federal government provides disaster assistance. But for the reasons I've mentioned, I'm concerned that creating a permanent authorization for the CDBG-DR program is not the right way to go. As President Reagan wisely noted, government programs are the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth, so we should tread carefully before we create a new one.